Since we've started on our Hujjah Academy, a course on logic and epistemology, I thought it'd be useful just to share some reflections on this topic on our YouTube channel. So, those of you who want to study this properly should subscribe to our course on the Hujjah Academy, and I'll share the link for you on the description to this video. This course is, of course, for everyone, not just for scholars, non-scholars, basically anyone who is really concerned as a parent, perhaps, or even as an imam or a teacher, about the question of how do we ascertain truth and how do we reason properly and make sure that we don't make errors in our judgment. So, logic is a science. We call it mantiq in Arabic. And logic as a Islamic science is very, very important. Before I talk about that, I want to establish something very, very important in this episode, in this video. That is that logic today, modern logic, if you like, is a discipline that studies valid form of inferences. Now, I want to make it very, very clear. There's a difference between something being valid and something being sound. I'm just mentioning this now because in the future, I will make this distinction between them. So there's a farq. There's a difference between something being valid and something being sound. And when we talk about valid inferences, what we're basically saying, as an example, is that you have a premise or you have some form of evidence and you make a conclusion, you make a logical conclusion. So it could be something to do with observation. So, for example, if I see some smoke behind the tree or behind the bush in front of me, I can make a inference, a valid inference, that there's a fire. Or if I hear with my ears that there's a bird singing outside, I can make a valid inference that there is a bird in the garden. But it can also take forms that are slightly different, more abstract, if you like. For example, usually, and I'm going to just give you an example now, you have two premises and you have a conclusion. So the first premise might be, for example, if A, then B. If A, then B. And your second premise might be if A. So your first premise would be if A, then B, and your second premise might be A. So your conclusion would be therefore B. So if A, then B. The second premise is A. Therefore, the conclusion will be therefore B. And this form, this type is called a form. So we call this a form of inference. Because what we're doing here is rather than thinking about seeing some smoke or hearing a bird, it's an abstract representation. You're thinking about this in abstract terms, right? So your mind is being exercised here. And there are in the world an unlimited number of inferences. Say, for example, let's go to my example again. And say, for example, we replace A with a preposition, it is daytime, and B with the preposition, the sun has risen. We will now have, from all the inferences that we can make, a particular inference. So the first premise will be, if it is daytime, then the sun has risen. And you can think of examples by yourself. If it is daytime, then the sun has risen. That's my first premise. My second premise will be, it is daytime. So what will be my conclusion, my friends? It will be that the sun has indeed risen. Now, this is called a valid inference because the truth of the two premises, first premise and the second premise, entails the truth of the conclusion. Okay, the formula of valid inference is such that if its premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. So if the first premise, if it is daytime, then the sun has risen, and the second premise that it is daytime, if these two are true, then the conclusion necessarily must also be true. So the conclusion is also true. Now, I mentioned right at the beginning that there is a difference between something being valid and something being sound. So an inference might be valid, like the one I just gave you as an example, but it might be unsound. And unsound or soundness has to do with the truth of something. This is where logic and epistemology are important. I'll talk about what epistemology is in a second for you. So let me give an example of something that's valid but actually unsound. So the first premise might be, if science is true, then religion is a myth. If science is true, then religion is a myth. It's not true. Religion is false. Second premise, science is true. And so the conclusion will be that the religion is a myth. Now, this is valid. This is perfectly valid because it's constructed in such a way that you come to that conclusion. But is it sound? And you know whether something is sound by looking at the premise. Now, you can see straight away, this is something that we do every day, we reason every day. But if your premise is wrong, if your premise is invalid or untrue, then you're going to come to false conclusions. This is why we always, when we reason or when we debate or when we think about the premises very, very carefully. So the inference here is valid because the form of the inferences is such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true, right? So it's valid in that sense that if science is true, if I say as my first premise, if science is true, then religion is a myth, and my second premise is that science is true, then naturally I'm going to come to the conclusion that religion is indeed a myth. But the conclusion here is not true, right? So it's valid, but it's not true because the first premise is false. To say that if science is true, then religion is a myth, that's not true. That's a false premise straight away. So this is how you begin. This is how you do the basics of logic. I'm just showing you this in this first episode. If God wills, I'll go into more detail in the future. So this inference is valid in the example that I gave, but of course, it's not sound. So an inference is sound when, number one, it's valid, and number two, that the premises are true in of themselves. These two things are very, very important for a inference to be sound. So you should know the difference between a sound inference and a valid inference. There's one more thing I want to say here before I conclude this session. Modern logic is only concerned with the validity of inferences. It's not concerned with whether your inferences, whether your premises are true. Okay, it doesn't look at the soundness of your premises. It just wants to make sure they're valid. So, for example, in the example that I gave, if science is true, then religion is a myth. Modern logic will say, well, as long as that's a valid premises, we'll accept it. It won't question the fact that actually this is not true. If science is true, then religion is a myth. This is unsound. They are only interested in it being valid. So they don't really study their soundness. And in future videos, I'll explain the history of why that is the case today. So when we try to work out or discern whether a particular inference is sound, this requires knowledge of the disciplines that study the premises that are being used. So these premises 1 and 2, A and B, you need to have other sciences that will help you to make sure that you're making sound inferences. And so you would need, for example, an understanding of the philosophy of science or the philosophy of religion. And of course, it also requires knowledge of certain universal kinds of questions that are, you need to know them to determine the truth of any particular premise. So you need to have the sciences to know that, okay, is this premise true? Whereas modern logic doesn't do that. So this requires, as I mentioned before, knowledge of epistemology. And I'll talk about epistemology a lot. But epistemology is really the study of nature, origin, and the limits of human knowledge. This is what epistemology is. What is it that we can know? How much can we know? And then you have the question of metaphysics. If you've been following my Shah Waliullah course on our YouTube channel, you'll see that I talk about metaphysics a lot. And metaphysics is the study of everything that exists in so far as it exists. But you also need to have sciences such as philosophy of language, which is the study of the nature of language, meaning, and signification. I'll talk about them later on. And of course, you also need to have an understanding of the philosophy of the mind, the study of the nature of mental phenomena, and the relation of the mind, not only into the body, but also to the world that exists out there. So, in order to know these premises one and two, to know whether they are true or not, you need to have these sciences. But modern logic dispenses with all. They don't do that. So modern logicians, they don't do that because they're not trying to work out a truth of something. They're trying to work out, well, how can we optimize machines? And you see that this is where it's used in AI and technology. But we're, as Muslims, interested in big questions, the question of truth and so forth. So what happens is in modern logic is these sort of questions of truth are relegated to philosophy. This is what philosophers do. This is for them. We're not interested in these things. We just want to make sure that the premises are valid, and we're not interested in them being sound. We're not interested in them having truthfulness or not. But as Muslims, and even other traditions, logic does study the questions that are important: metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of language, and the philosophy of the mind. Because we are interested in truth. We're not here to optimize machines, we're here to optimize the mind. And to make sound, and not just merely valid inferences, means that we need to know, how do we know something is true, especially when it comes to God and His religion. And this has been at the heart of Islamic scholarship, and it's been the purpose, and it remains the purpose of logic in the Islamic tradition. In the next episode, if God wills, I'll go into some detail about the journey from Aristotle to modern logic. If you found this useful, please leave some comments behind. And if you feel that I should do more on this, please do let me know. And I will see you soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.